You've been trying to earn what Jesus already gave for free. Imagine standing in front of an ancient vault, buried beneath centuries of dust, a chamber sealed since the dawn of human striving. Inside that vault, hidden beneath layers of religion, fear, and guilt, lies the one treasure every soul craves: freedom. Not political freedom, not financial ease, not the illusion of doing whatever I please. Something far deeper, the kind of freedom that can be revoked by governments or undone by failure. That hidden vault has a name. Galatians chapter 5e. The Apostle Paul wrote it not from luxury, but from heartbreak. Picture him, battered, scarred, miles away from the people who once greeted him as a messenger from heaven. Now a report reaches his weary hands. The churches in the region of Galatia, the very believers who once danced in the joy of grace, are turning back. They're trading liberation for law. Paul feels the weight of that betrayal. These men and women had seen miracles, heard the good news that Christ broke every chain. But new teachers slipped in, well-dressed and persuasive, whispering, "Faith is good, but not enough. To be fully accepted, you must add more. More rituals, more requirements, more performance." To Paul, that wasn't just bad theology, it was spiritual sabotage. He takes up his pen, more like a sword, and writes a letter that would shake the ancient world. With one blazing sentence he thunders, "Stand firm in the liberty you already have, the liberty Christ himself secured for you. Don't be entangled again in the old chains." It's as if he's shouting through time, "Why are you polishing the shackles I died to destroy?" This chapter is no calm essay. It's a rescue mission. Grace versus rules. Trust versus earning. Spirit versus self-effort. The first thing Paul does is redefine freedom. Because for most of history, and let's be honest, for most of us, freedom means getting my own way. Freedom means no one tells me what to do. Freedom means independence. But in spiritual reality, freedom is not the right to do whatever I want. It's finally being able to want what's right. Paul's entire argument hangs on this divine paradox. Trying harder to be holy makes you a prisoner, but surrendering to grace makes you free. The Galatians couldn't see it. To them, the law seemed holy, structured, safe. It told you what to wear, what to eat, when to sacrifice. It even measured the distance you could walk on a Saturday. The rules offered control, a checklist for the conscience. Who wouldn't want measurable religion? But Paul knew the hidden cost. Every rule you add becomes another bar on your cell. Every ritual you rely on becomes another wall between you and the one who already fulfilled them. He remembers his own past, a Pharisee raised under the strictest codes, a man who measured worth by obedience. Yet when he met Christ, those elaborate trophies of righteousness turned to dust. He realized that you can scrub the outside perfectly and still rot inside. That's why Galatians 5 bursts with urgency. Paul opens the vault of human freedom, not with a lecture, but with anguish. He reminds them, and us, that freedom was purchased at infinite cost. The cross wasn't a down payment waiting for us to finish the installments. It was paid in full. Now that declaration of paid in full sounds like music, unless you've built your identity on earning. For those teachers in Galatia, grace was dangerous. It cancelled their business model. If salvation comes free, who needs the gatekeepers? If anyone can walk in forgiven, who needs the rule keepers standing at the door with clipboards? Paul isn't just fighting theology, he's fighting spiritual pride. The same pride that whispers in every generation, "Sure, God forgives, but you'd better prove you were worth forgiving." And so, in this fiery chapter, every word drips with both heartbreak and hope. Freedom, Paul says, is not the absence of authority. It's the presence of the right authority. A heart governed by the Spirit instead of by fear. A soul led not by checklist, but by companionship with God himself. Picture a prisoner who has spent decades behind bars. The warden opens the door and says, "You're free," but the inmate hesitates, too used to the walls, unsure how to walk outside. That's the tragedy Paul saw in Galatia. People so accustomed to bondage that freedom felt frightening. He pleads, "Don't go back. Don't rebuild the prison I already tore down." Galatians 5 is the anthem of the inner life. It's where theology becomes blood and breath. It tells every believer that real liberty isn't political, financial, or emotional. It's spiritual. Think of a nation declaring independence while its citizens remain enslaved within their hearts. What good is outer liberty when the soul still kneels before fear and guilt? Christ came to free both the citizen and the conscience. Under Roman rule, Paul's audience knew something about oppression. Rome's laws governed their streets, the temple's laws governed their souls. Both, in their own way, demanded tribute. And into that world came a new kingdom, invisible yet unstoppable, a kingdom of grace. Grace doesn't demand payment. It dissolves the debt. Imagine the first time those Galatians heard Paul preach, his voice echoing through the crowded markets. You don't earn favor. You receive it. You don't climb to heaven. Heaven came down to you. The people wept, sang, rejoiced. Chains fell from their hearts. But as months passed, the old voices returned. Are you sure that's enough? Shouldn't you add circumcision, a few traditions? Some proof that you're really serious. That's where the vault slowly began to close again. And so Paul writes this epistle like a locksmith with divine fire in his pen, prying open the mechanism that the enemy of grace had tried to seal shut. Every page glows with one truth. Freedom is not achieved, it's received. Our modern world still chases liberty on every front. Political, social, sexual, psychological. We declare wars for it, make slogans about it, tattoo the word on our skin, yet we remain restless. Why? Because you can vote, spend, shout, and indulge, and still be imprisoned by yourself. True liberty begins when the heart drops its weapons and yields its war to the Spirit of God. Picture a pair of oxen, massive, strong, yet forced beneath a heavy wooden yoke. It presses into their shoulders, carving grooves into their skin each time they try to move. That's what Paul meant when he warned the Galatians. Don't be entangled again under a yoke of bondage. He knew exactly what that looked like, because for 1,000 years Israel had worn that yoke. Now the law itself wasn't evil. Far from it. It was holy, pure, and perfectly designed. It was God's brilliant masterpiece meant to guide his people like a road sign pointing toward redemption. The problem came when humanity did what humanity always does. We took the signpost and started worshipping the sign. The 10 Commandments were never supposed to be 10 cages. They were a mirror, showing the dirt on the soul, not a soap strong enough to clean it, but generation after generation tried to wash in that mirror, rubbing feverishly, wondering why the stain wouldn't lift. By the 1st century, religion had become a factory, churning out guilt more efficiently than peace. The Mosaic Code had been expanded into hundreds of supplemental rules. How far you could walk before it was work, how to tithe even down to garden herbs, how to wash pots in precisely the right ritual sequence. The priests built entire libraries cataloging holiness, and ordinary people were crushed beneath the weight. So when Paul describes the law as a yoke, his metaphor slices deep into the cultural memory. Everyone who heard it could almost feel the splintered wood on their own necks. The tragedy wasn't that God had given a bad gift. The tragedy was that the recipients turned that gift into chains. It's a recurring theme in human history. Give us freedom, and we'll make a new system to control it. Give us grace, and we'll build rules to measure it. Even outside religion, societies do this dance. We create laws to preserve liberty and end up writing legislation thick enough to suffocate the concept itself. Paul saw this trajectory clearly. He'd lived it. As a Pharisee, he had prided himself on protecting God's reputation through regulations. To him, holiness meant measuring out obedience like currency. But once he encountered Jesus, Paul realized something devastating. The more you trust your checklist, the less you trust your Redeemer. He wanted the Galatians to see that danger clearly, because the new teachers were using very old tools, fear and shame. They promised safety through performance. They offered anxiety disguised as devotion. And who doesn't want absolute certainty? If religion can package salvation in bullet points, the insecure heart will buy every one of them. But grace refuses to be commodified. The imagery Paul employs is both agricultural and personal. The yoke, the slave market, the burdened shoulders. Imagine walking all day in the heat under a beam of wood tied across your neck. No matter how much strength you have, the yoke defines your posture. You move only as your master allows. That's what rule-based religion does to the human soul. It incentivizes good behavior through the fear of punishment, not out of love for the Father. And over time, fear breeds exhaustion, not transformation. Paul's antidote to this spiritual fatigue was shocking in its simplicity. Stand firm in your freedom and refuse to submit again. That word, stand, implies resistance. He's saying, plant your feet, brace yourself, because bondage always tries to make a comeback. Even today, that warning resonates. Modern believers still drift back towards spiritual bookkeeping. Today, I prayed enough. I gave enough. I attended enough. When the checklist feels complete, we walk taller. When it doesn't, we bow lower. Either way, we've put the yoke back on. True spirituality, Paul argues, is not measured in check marks, but in connection. The Spirit of God doesn't operate like a bureaucrat. He works like oxygen. You don't earn your next breath. You receive it because you're alive. The same is true for grace. You inhale it daily, lose awareness of it, and you start to suffocate under your own efforts. Let's step into the historical context for a moment. The Galatians weren't ethnic Jews. They were Gentiles, Greek and Roman converts who had come to faith through Paul's preaching. They'd never lived under the Mosaic law before. But now, visiting teachers from Judea were insisting that to be true Christians, these Gentiles had to adopt Jewish customs, including circumcision. That concept might have sounded reasonable at first. After all, Jesus himself was Jewish, but Paul saw beyond the ritual. The moment circumcision or any external action became a prerequisite for belonging to Christ, grace was nullified. Because the gospel isn't Jesus plus, it's Jesus period. The issue of outward compliance touches a nerve that runs through all religious experience. How do you measure faith? Humans love metrics, but grace demands trust instead of tally marks. So when Paul writes about the yoke of bondage, he's essentially challenging every system that tries to put a measuring stick on mercy. Religion says, follow the system and you'll be accepted. Grace whispers, you're accepted, now follow the Spirit. It's an order reversal that changes everything. That reversal also mirrors a psychological truth. Studies on motivation, whether in schools, workplaces, or sports, show that external rewards can spark short-term effort but hinder deep passion. When people work only for approval, creativity dies. In the same way, when believers obey merely to avoid condemnation, love collapses into fear. Paul understood that the healthiest obedience grows from relationship, not regulation. A spirit-led heart doesn't need 40 rules about generosity to give. Love just gives. It doesn't need pages of purity codes to value holiness. Love naturally resists whatever would harm the beloved. That's why the gospel's freedom doesn't abolish morality, it transforms it. Morality becomes the music of gratitude instead of the marching beat of duty. Let's pause on the emotional undercurrent here. Paul isn't a dry scholar scolding a misbehaving congregation. He is like a father watching his grown children voluntarily climb back into the attic of their old prison house because they miss the predictability of captivity. Stand firm, he pleads, in effect saying, don't exchange the wild joy of the Spirit for the dull safety of religion. That's a message every generation needs, because religious institutions, whatever the century, tend to drift toward control. What begins as revelation often calcifies into regulation. Revival movements turn into rituals. Personal experiences of grace harden into doctrines printed on charts. Over time, the machinery of religion starts humming louder than the voice of God it once worshipped. It happened in ancient Israel, it happened in Galatia, and if we're honest, it can happen in our own modern churches. That's the sobering mirror Paul holds up. And yet, here is where hope breaks through. If a soul can recognize its own chains, it's already halfway to freedom. Paul's words still echo to anyone burned by spiritual bureaucracy. Don't confuse God's laws with human systems. The law was holy, but humanity turned it into an idol engraved with its own pride. When an idol is made of gold, we melt it down. When an idol is made of good intentions, we keep polishing it until it blinds us. Paul wants believers to stop polishing and start breathing. Because grace doesn't shine, it illuminates. That's the beauty of this letter. It's not against holiness, it's against hopelessness. It's not anti-law, it's anti-bondage. And the tone slowly shifts now as the narrative moves from describing those chains to exposing the greatest counterfeit freedom of all. When someone claims, "Yes, you need Jesus," but then adds, "and a little extra proof." The controversy that shook the early church wasn't an argument about minor rituals or cultural tastes. It was about the most dangerous equation ever written in religion. Jesus something, salvation. That tiny plus sign almost destroyed the gospel. Let's rewind to the first generation after Christ's resurrection. The message was spreading like wildfire. Former pagans, Greeks, Romans, slaves, merchants, people from every background, were discovering the shocking news that through faith in Christ, they could be reconciled to God. No temple membership required, no special ethnic lineage, no ritual surgery. But that very inclusivity disturbed those who had built their identity on being the chosen ones under the law. When Paul left the region of Galatia, a group of polished, impressive teachers moved in. They weren't openly hostile. They were clever. They began with affirmation, "We also believe in Jesus, just like Paul taught you." Then came the subtle twist. "But to be complete, to be truly acceptable, you need to obey the law of Moses too. After all, God gave those commandments first. Surely he hasn't changed his mind." Their argument made sense on paper. They even had scripture to back it up. They quoted promises to Abraham about circumcision. They bundled grace and tradition into one tidy package. And most dangerously, they offered something the human heart secretly craves: certainty through control. Circumcision became their flagship requirement, the visible badge of belonging. Perform it, and you could rest secure that you'd covered all your bases. Refuse it, and you are instantly viewed with suspicion, maybe even exiled from fellowship. To the Galatians, new believers still learning theology, it sounded reasonable. Why not just do both? Believe in Jesus and check off a few old commandments just to be safe? But Paul saw that compromise as spiritual suicide. He writes with fire, "If you depend on that ritual to make you right before God, then Christ's sacrifice becomes worthless to you." Think about that statement. It's a divine mic drop. Paul is saying that the moment you try to earn what has already been given, you cancel the gift. Let's spotlight those equations again. Jesus plus anything, nothing. Jesus plus nothing, everything. That's not poetic exaggeration, it's theological thermite, because the essence of grace is that it's unearnable. The moment you add a price tag, it stops being grace and becomes merchandise. Paul's outrage makes sense when you remember his personal history. Before meeting Christ, he had built his life on spiritual resume building. If righteousness had been a competition, he ranked at the top of the leaderboard. But his Damascus Road encounter flipped the table. He realized that everything once called gain was actually loss. He'd been depositing religious confidence into an account that already had infinite credit. So when another generation of teachers began selling upgrades to grace, Paul heard the hiss of the same old serpent who once asked Eve, "Did God really give you everything?" The deception always sounds pious. You can trust God, but maybe hedge your bets with good behavior. This is where theology meets psychology. Human beings hate feeling helpless. In every culture, we invent systems to guarantee outcomes: karma, penance, merit, moral scales. We want to contribute something measurable because dependence feels weak. But grace demands vulnerability, accepting that you contribute nothing but your need, and that offends pride. The circumcision controversy crystallized that offense into flesh and blood. It wasn't about a single act of surgery, it was about identity. Were Gentiles second-class citizens in the kingdom? Did they need to mimic Jewish customs to be legitimate Christians? Paul answers with divine defiance. Under the new covenant, there are no second-class citizens. The only mark that shows you belong to Christ isn't cut into your body. It's engraved in your heart by the Spirit. That's revolutionary. It shifts holiness from the surface to the center. Let's pause for a vivid image. Imagine two people standing before God. One proudly clutches a list of personal achievements, prayers said, rituals obeyed, charitable deeds completed. The other stands empty-handed, tears in their eyes, trusting entirely in mercy. In heaven's economy, the second person owns everything, because the first is still trying to buy what cannot be sold. Paul's language in this section burns with irony. He points out that those preaching circumcision aren't even keeping all the laws themselves. They just want others to bear the mark so they can boast about their converts. It's spiritual marketing. Collect enough visible compliance, and you look successful. 2,000 years later, that temptation hasn't vanished. Modern versions of the same false gospel still echo in subtle slogans. Now, real Christians vote this way. Real believers dress like this. True faith is proven by this particular lifestyle brand, denomination, or ritual. Every time we add an adjective before the word Christian, we risk subtracting grace behind the scenes. The same logic also fuels comparison. Instead of rejoicing in Christ's finished work, we build scoreboard spirituality, tallying points on purity, service, or doctrinal prowess. The result? Pride for those at the top, despair for those at the bottom, and exhaustion for everyone in between. Paul flips that scoreboard upside down. He declares that the only thing that counts now is faith expressing itself through love. That one sentence dismantles centuries of hierarchy. Because love is stubbornly unquantifiable, you can chart it on a spreadsheet or prove it with a ritual knife. Here's where this ancient debate collides with modern life. The world still runs on the merit system, grades, promotions, social status. We're wired to perform and be rewarded. So it's unsurprising that many approach God the same way, treating faith like an internship that could lead to a permanent position if our work is good enough. Paul shatters that illusion. Jesus didn't hire us. He adopted us. And once you're family, you don't show up each morning afraid of being fired. You live loved, not auditioning for affection. But that's not just theology, it's liberation psychology. Studies on acceptance and self-esteem consistently show that unconditional belonging unleashes healthier behavior than conditional approval. People thrive when love is secure. God invented that system long before psychologists gave it a name. That's the power Paul fights to defend in Galatians 5. He senses that if the church loses this battle, future generations will spend centuries tangled in sacramental red tape instead of soaring in spirit-led freedom. And he was right. History proves it. Whenever the gospel drifts toward grace plus, revival fades, replaced by control and corruption. The pattern repeats. Earn, burn out, reform, rediscover grace, repeat. Paul's thunderous paragraph is timeless prevention. Keep the gospel pure, because dilution is death. Consider water. Add 1 drop of cyanide, and it's no longer life-giving liquid, it's poison. In the same way, add 1 ounce of must-earn-it to grace, and you lose the flavor of heaven. And just like water, grace flows best when unobstructed. It seeps into the deepest cracks, reviving barren ground. The law can diagnose your dryness, but only grace can send rain. Paul doesn't despise the law. He honors it by showing what it was always meant to do: point straight to Christ, then step aside. The law is like a faithful but limited teacher. Once the ultimate mentor arrives, class is dismissed. For the Galatians, that meant choosing between 2 systems: the old ladder of human effort, the new bridge of divine mercy. You can't climb and cross simultaneously. Paul urges them to take the bridge, the one built with beams of grace nailed on Calvary's hill. Now the letter turns inward. After dismantling external religion, Paul exposes an even more intimate battlefield, the one within the believer. Because the greatest threat to freedom often doesn't come from outside teachers, but from the inner tug-of-war between flesh and spirit. That shift in focus launches us into the next act of this cinematic journey: the civil war lurking inside every soul. Every empire eventually faces civil war, and the human heart is no exception. Inside every believer, there's a tug-of-war so fierce that even the strongest personalities can be torn in two. Paul calls this internal struggle the war between the flesh and the spirit. If the earlier parts of Galatians were written with the precision of a lawyer, this section reads like the journal of a soldier. The apostle drops his theological pen and picks up a mirror. He lets us see ourselves, divided, conflicted, yet desperately loved. Let's visualize it. Picture a kingdom across 2 landscapes. On one side, fertile valleys glowing in sunlight, where life thrives under gentle breezes. On the other, dark hills of scorched earth where old fortresses still smolder, ruled by the remnants of rebellion. Between them runs a trembling boundary line. That's your soul. And every day, skirmishes erupt along that border. Those skirmishes are the daily decisions of life. The flesh doesn't necessarily mean the physical body. It's shorthand for the self that insists on independence. It's the ego's anthem. I can handle this myself. The spirit is the new nature birthed when grace moved in. It whispers the opposite. You were never meant to handle it alone. That's why the same person can worship passionately on Sunday morning and lose their temper Sunday afternoon. Both kingdoms claim ownership of the heart, and whichever side you feed gains ground. Paul doesn't sugarcoat it. He admits that even believers experience this clash constantly. It's not proof of failure, it's proof of life. Dead things don't wrestle. Here's his profound insight: victory doesn't come by strengthening the flesh to behave better. That's just teaching the rebel to wear a uniform. True victory comes when the spirit takes the throne and the self yields. To make this tangible, let's borrow a modern metaphor, the car Jew. Imagine 2 images side by side. In one, you're walking alone under a ruthless sun, sweat stinging your eyes, exhausted but stubborn. Every step represents self-effort, trying to stay moral, stay positive, stay perfect. In the other, your same weary self is invited into a friend's car, air conditioner humming, music playing. You're still moving toward the same destination, but not by your own strength. You're carried. That difference, exertion versus grace, is the whole Christian experience summarized. Paul's instruction is deceptively simple. Walk by the Spirit, and you will not be ruled by the cravings of the flesh. He doesn't say, flee the flesh, and you'll find the Spirit. He reverses the logic. Focus on companionship with God, and the appetites that once ruled you will lose power naturally. That's radically different from self-improvement spirituality, where success depends on stronger willpower. Grace-based transformation begins with surrender, not strategy. In psychological terms, that's like shifting from external control to internal transformation. Modern therapy models talk about aligning with intrinsic motivation rather than punishment-based control. Paul taught that principle centuries earlier. The Spirit renews desires from the inside out, changing want to before he demands have to. Let's put it into an everyday scene. You wake up determined to stay calm today. You pray, maybe drink coffee out of a mug that says, "Blessed." The traffic, however, didn't get the memo. Horns blare, someone cuts you off, the old anger rises, and within 30 minutes, you're frustrated with yourself for being frustrated. That spiral, failure followed by guilt, followed by renewed resolve, is the treadmill of the flesh. Now picture the same morning, but you start with dependence rather than determination. Spirit, drive this day. I'll ride shotgun. You still hit traffic, but this time the eruption is met with a whisper. You are free to respond differently. Suddenly, peace wins the round. Not because you forced it, but because someone stronger within you did. That's how invisible wars are won, moment by moment, grace by grace. Paul doesn't promote passivity. He promotes partnership. The Spirit isn't a replacement driver who kicks you out of the car. He's a co-occupant, guiding your hands on the wheel and gently saying, "Let me steer here." That changes how commandment-keeping even looks. Instead of reading "don't lie" as an external order, you begin to sense the Spirit awakening truth love inside you until lying simply feels foreign. It's transformation by intimacy. Now let's take a quick journey into Paul's own autobiography. The man who wrote this had suffered shipwreck, prison, betrayal from both friends and enemies, yet he sounds astonishingly free, almost joyful. How? Because his peace didn't depend on pain levels or circumstances. It came from the inner government of the Spirit. His soul's civil war hadn't ended, but its outcome was decided. The Spirit held the capital city. Modern readers, especially in high-pressure Western cultures, resonate deeply with this. We fight inner wars daily against addiction, anger, anxiety, distraction. The culture whispers, "Fix yourself, reinvent yourself." Paul whispers back, "Relinquish yourself." That's a world-turning difference. Spiritual maturity isn't the absence of struggle. It's learning which voice to heed mid-struggle. The flesh shouts demands, the Spirit speaks invitations. One says, "Prove yourself." The other says, "Rest in me." Let's think in neurological terms for a moment. Studies in habit formation show that willpower alone quickly depletes, but attachment, relational connection, rewires brain pathways. Love outperforms law. That's why walking in the Spirit works. It's not mechanical effort, it's relational proximity. Paul would nod knowingly if he read those studies today and say, "Exactly." The mind renewed by the Spirit physically changes its responses. True freedom isn't mystical abstraction. It's emotional and even biological renewal under divine influence. Now this Civil War imagery has a purpose beyond introspection. Paul lays bare this tension to prepare believers for action, not to wallow in self-analysis, but to realize they're not fighting solo campaigns. The Spirit is both ally and armory. He lists what happens when the flesh dominates: jealousy, strife, impurity, and a whole catalogue of chaos. Then he contrasts that bleak landscape with something breathtaking: the fruit that naturally ripens when the Spirit reigns. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those qualities aren't manufactured. They're cultivated. We'll explore them more deeply in the next part, but for now remember this: Fruit doesn't grunt to grow. It receives sunlight and nourishment and expands quietly. Likewise, spiritual growth is not performance under pressure, but cooperation under grace. Paul's warning about the flesh is not condemnation, but compassion. He's saying, don't waste your new freedom building old prisons. Every act of selfishness reconstructs the very walls Christ demolished. Every burst of spirit-led love tears those walls down again. He reminds them, and us, that the old self has already been crucified. Yes, it still screams from the cross, demanding attention, but it's a defeated rebel. The Spirit isn't fighting to win ownership. He's enforcing the victory already secured. The truth reframes the whole fight. You're not battling for freedom. You're battling from freedom. Let's return to our car metaphor for a cinematic close to this section. Life hurls potholes, detours, and flat tires. The driver who insists on self-reliance spends the trip tense, gripping the wheel, checking mirrors for potential failure. The one who drives with the Spirit beside them rolls down the window, breathes, and says, "You navigate, I'll enjoy the ride." Same road, same conditions, totally different soul. That's the secret Paul unpacks in Galatians 5. When Christ liberated you, it wasn't a one-time parole, it was permanent adoption. You can experience turbulence without losing citizenship. The civil war may continue in skirmishes, but the verdict stands. The Spirit will win every time you let him lead. That victory within paves the way for the next revelation, the quiet confidence of waiting for righteousness by faith. Every war ends with a kind of silence. Smoke clears, dust settles, and amid the ruins, something faint but steady begins to grow. Hope. That's where Paul takes us next. From warfare to waiting. He calls it the hope of righteousness. Now, those words can sound almost contradictory. Hope suggests something future, a promise not yet visible. Righteousness sounds finished, as though already settled. So how can both be true? Paul's genius lies right there, in holding these two truths together like twin threads in a single weave. He tells the Galatians and every believer that righteousness isn't an achievement waiting at the end of the race. It's an identity granted at the starting line. Yet its full glory hasn't unfolded yet. It's like a seed under soil. The life is already inside. You just can't see the harvest yet. Imagine a farmer in America's Midwest in early spring, thick gloves, wind biting his face. He kneels in a furrowed field and drops kernels into cold earth. From that point forward, he lives by faith. Day after day, he checks the sky, feels the soil, resists the urge to dig up the seed. He trusts process over panic because he knows something invisible is already working. That is what Paul calls us to do spiritually. Wait with confidence because the life of Christ has already been planted within. You're not becoming righteous by slow improvement. You're discovering the righteousness that's been implanted since the moment grace took root. This flips the entire self-improvement world on its head. Modern culture preaches that identity flows from performance. Do enough, then you'll be someone. Paul preaches the opposite. You are someone, therefore live like it. That subtle reversal changes everything from psychology to worship. When you know you're accepted, obedience becomes expression rather than transaction. You serve not to earn, but to celebrate. Now let's step into history for a moment. To Paul's Jewish contemporaries, the concept of righteousness was courtroom language, status before the judge. A person was righteous when the judge declared them innocent. That's what Paul dares to apply to every person in Christ. It's as if the judge of heaven slams the gavel and announces, "Case closed, you're free," not because you argued well, but because someone already served your sentence. That's righteousness as a verdict, not as a wage. But then Paul adds that word that confuses on purpose, hope. Because while the verdict is issued, the final unveiling still awaits. We are righteous in position, yet still watching that reality bloom in practice. Think of it as both a seed planted and a flower still opening. This mixture, already secure yet still unfolding, protects us from two equal dangers: despair and pride. Despair says, "I'll never change." Pride says, "I'm already perfect." Hope says, "I'm becoming outwardly what God has already made me inwardly." That's why Paul's metaphor of waiting fits. Patience is not passivity, it's active trust. To our microwave generation, waiting seems weak, but faith-based waiting is persistent rebellion against visible circumstances. It's telling the anxious mind, you don't need proof to believe promises. Let's bring this home to modern life. We live in a culture obsessed with immediate evidence, fitness trackers, instant credit scores, likes, followers. Everything's measured now. You can quantify success at 2 a.m. on your phone. Yet spiritual growth refuses to rush. The soul matures on divine time, like seasons turning in the heartland. Paul's statement cuts through that impatience like sunlight through morning fog. We eagerly await the righteousness that we already possess by faith. Meaning, stop uprooting your progress to check if it's working. Let grace germinate. Here's a story that illustrates this. In a small town in Pennsylvania, a man inherited an old family farm, neglected, overgrown, worth almost nothing on paper. He considered selling it, but decided to plant it first. For months, he worked in obscurity. To the neighbors, he looked naive, maybe even foolish. Then one day, while clearing a ditch, he struck a layer of rich shale, evidence of oil. What everyone else dismissed as barren ground became the most valuable land in the county. Righteousness works the same way. On the surface, you may see nothing but rough soil, old habits, fears, imperfections. But hidden below lies a deposit of divine life richer than you can imagine. Your worth isn't determined by visible progress, but by invisible placement, Christ in you. Paul knows the Galatians are tired of striving, so he points them toward endurance. The Spirit's fruit takes time, but it's guaranteed growth. Faith, Paul insists, doesn't perform, it persists. That persistence builds something beautiful. Confidence anchored in what God has said rather than what you feel. Feelings fluctuate, promises don't. When Paul writes about waiting for righteousness, he is really describing anticipation for a future unveiling. One day, we'll see ourselves as God sees us, completely radiant, fully whole. Until that day, hope keeps the door open between heaven's certainty and earth's process. Now imagine hope not as idle optimism, but as tension held by trust. Picture a bowstring drawn back. The energy is stored and aimed at a promise. Hope is that drawn string, taut but unbroken, aimed toward what faith foresees. That's why Christian hope isn't wishful thinking, it's patient certainty. It is the quiet conviction that the best chapters are already written, even if you were still mid-sentence. For Paul's audience, surrounded by Roman oppression and religious confusion, that was revolutionary comfort. They didn't have political power or social privilege, but they had an unshakable identity. The world might label them outcasts. Heaven labeled them righteous. Let's pause to reflect on how countercultural that still feels. Today, success gets defined by output. Job titles, income brackets, social circles. But identity anchored in Christ laughs at fluctuations of fortune. The Christian hope says, my true resume sits in heaven and reads beloved, forgiven, righteous. That realization doesn't breed arrogance, it breeds peace. Because when your value comes from grace, you stop competing for worth. Paul's teaching functions like an inner Sabbath. Rest for the perennially striving heart. It invites you to fix your eyes not on your pace, but on your position. That's why he often pairs faith and hope. Faith receives, hope waits. If we contrast the two forces again, law and grace, this is where their spirits differ most starkly. The law shouts, "Work until you're worthy." Grace whispers, "Wait, because you're already worthy." This truth also shapes how we treat others. When you know you're accepted despite imperfection, you extend the same patience outward. Judgmentalism evaporates in the climate of grace. You stop demanding immediate proof of holiness from others because you remember how slowly your own seed has sprouted. Hope doesn't demand instant bloom. It celebrates hidden growth. That transforms community life. Churches that live by grace radiate gentleness. Those ruled by performance radiate exhaustion. That is why Paul used hope of righteousness isn't a private meditation, it keys collective health. A grace-centered community becomes an oasis of patience in a world addicted to verdicts. He reminds readers that the only thing capable of shaping righteousness that lasts is faith working through love, not fear of punishment, not pressure of expectation. Love. And love is patient, always has been. At this point, the music of the narrative begins to swell again, preparing for the finale. After warning the Galatians against bondage, unveiling true freedom, guiding them through internal warfare, and establishing unshakable hope, Paul now lifts the curtain one last time to show what freedom looks like in motion. It's not rebellion, it's transformation. Liberty looks different when the dust of battle settles. It doesn't swagger, it blooms. Paul has led us through every valley, from the vault of freedom to the chains of religion, through deception, inner war, and patient hope. And now he unveils the reward, life in the Spirit. He paints two portraits side by side, as vivid today as they were in the first-century world, one in the bleak tones of self-driven living, the other glowing with the colors of divine character. The first is the title, Works of the Flesh, a grim gallery of what happens when our ego rules. The second is the fruit of the Spirit, an orchard of qualities produced when love governs. Notice Paul's careful grammar. Works versus fruit. Works are manufactured. Fruit is organic. Works rely on effort. Fruit relies on nurture. Works exhaust. Fruit refreshes. Let's step into the first painting. When the self takes control, the canvas fills with chaos, jealousy, outbursts of rage, impurity, rivalry, envy, and addiction. Nothing new. Scroll any news feed and you'll see these brushstrokes everywhere. These aren't abstract sins. They're symptoms of a soul disconnected from its source. Paul lists them not to shame, but to diagnose. They're warning lights on the dashboard saying, "You've taken back the wheel again." Then he turns to the other side of the gallery. Against that darkness stands something almost musical. He lists 9 fruits: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. They aren't moral trophies. They're miracles of inner chemistry, evidence that the Spirit is alive and well inside. And unlike the works of the flesh, which splinter and divide, the fruit of the Spirit integrates, makes the person whole, coherent, and alive. Each word deserves its own close-up. Love. Not sentiment or attraction, but decision. The capacity to value others even when emotion fades. It's the very DNA of the divine, pulsing quietly through ordinary days. Joy. Not pleasure's high, but a baseline gladness that survives bad weather. It is what allows a mother to laugh through tears, or a man in prison to sing hymns at midnight. Peace but stillness of soul in a storm. Peace isn't circumstantial, it's environmental. Wherever the Spirit resides, anxiety loses its grip. Patience, the stretch between irritation and kindness. It's love's long fuse. In an impatient culture, patience is a scandal. Kindness, grace in motion. Simple, small, deliberate compassion that often feels unimpressive but moves mountains over time. Goodness, Moral integrity that doesn't negotiate. It's when motives and actions align, no dual lives, no masks. Faithfulness, consistency under pressure, the ability to keep promises when feelings fade. Heaven values it more than talent. Gentleness, power under control, like a river tamed into irrigation rather than floodwater. Self-control, freedom at its most paradoxical, the strength to say no for the sake of a greater yes. Together they form one fruit, different flavors of one root system, the Spirit's presence. Paul's closing argument is that true freedom doesn't lead to chaos, it leads to character. Law can restrain behavior, but only love can transform motive. Grace never grants permission to sin, it grants power not to. He anticipates an objection. If we're free from the law, won't that lead to moral anarchy? His answer, whispered like a seasoned teacher, live by the Spirit and you won't need chains. Because when the heart delights in righteousness, external policing becomes obsolete. Think of it like music. Laws are the notes on a page. The Spirit is the musician inside. When he plays, you don't think about reading, you think about rhythm, emotion, and beauty. Freedom in the Spirit isn't rebellion, it's resonance. Look again at the ninefold fruit. Doesn't it describe exactly what modern societies say they want? Love over hate, peace instead of anxiety, kindness in public discourse, self-control in excess. Humanity spends fortunes chasing what God gives freely through relationship. And because Paul's teaching is so practical, he grounds it in community life. He says, if you live in the Spirit, stay in step with the Spirit. In Greek dance imagery, it means to move in rhythm, not rushing ahead, not lagging behind. Life in the Spirit is choreography guided by divine tempo. That call to rhythm crushes comparison. One person's growth might look different from another. An apple doesn't to compete with an orange. Both testify to the same soil. When the Spirit rules a community, competition turns into mutual cultivation. Brothers and sisters stop watching each other's scorecards and start watering each other's gardens. Now that's freedom. It's the kind of liberty that doesn't whisper, I can do whatever I want, but sings, I finally want what I was created for. That's the paradox of redemption. The more you yield, the freer you become. Let's step back now, stretching the lens over all parts of this journey. Every step led from effort to rest, from performance to presence. Paul closes his letter with the humility of someone who knows power has shifted forever, from law tablets to living hearts. He urges his readers and us to keep sowing to the Spirit, invest time, attention, and affection in what nurtures love, because the harvest is guaranteed. And that's where Galatians 5 ceases to be ancient text and becomes living manifesto. Our world still chains itself with new kinds of law, filters of perfection, political identities, moral one-upmanship. The Spirit's invitation cuts through that noise. Come breathe again, walk with me, you're free. True freedom isn't an escape from responsibility. It's the rediscovery of purpose. It's when discipline blooms out of desire, not dread. No constitution can grant that liberty. No revolution can legislate it. It is a miracle of grace signed in Christ's blood and sealed by His Spirit. So the next time you feel tempted to measure your worth by productivity or popularity, remember the vault. The door stands open, the chains lie broken, and the Spirit still whispers freedom. Let that truth echo through whatever you face this week. On busy mornings, during quiet doubts, while scrolling headlines or sitting alone late at night, whenever pressure returns, breathe the same reminder Paul left his friends in Galatia. Freedom isn't doing as you please, it's finally being able to please God without fear. That's liberty, that's grace, that's life in the Spirit. Every chapter of this story has shouted one anthem. The miracles God performs aren't limited to seas parting or walls falling. They happen inside hearts every day that choose grace over guilt. So, if this message stirred your spirit, share it. Let others find the same vault, subscribe, and keep exploring the wonders written across Scripture's pages with us here on Bible, Miracles History, where ancient truth meets living power. Remember, you've been trying to earn what was already given for free. The gate stands open. Walk out and breathe.